Marcus Williams pulled his Mercedes into the gas station at 11:47 p.m., exhausted from the long flight from Chicago. The interview process had been grueling, but he had finally landed the job he'd worked his entire career toward. In just 3 days, he would officially become the youngest police chief in the city's history, at 38 years old. Tonight, however, he just wanted to grab some coffee and drive the final hour home to see his family. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Marcus walked toward the convenience store entrance. His expensive suit was wrinkled from travel, and his usually neat appearance showed signs of the 14-hour day he'd endured. He had been in meetings since dawn, answering questions about his vision for community policing, his plans to rebuild trust between officers and residents, and his commitment to reforming a department that had faced mounting criticism over the past year. As he reached for the door handle, Marcus noticed the tension in the store. The clerk, a young Hispanic man, kept glancing nervously at something behind the counter. 2 customers stood frozen near the magazine rack, their eyes wide with fear. Marcus's 20 years of law enforcement experience kicked in immediately. Something was very wrong. Through the glass door, he could see a man in dark clothing near the back of the store, gesturing aggressively at the clerk. The man's movements were erratic, and Marcus could hear muffled shouting even through the thick glass. His instincts told him this was either a robbery in progress or someone having a mental health crisis. Either way, innocent people were in danger. Marcus quietly pulled out his phone to call 911, but before he could dial, the situation escalated rapidly. The man at the counter threw a display of energy drinks to the floor, sending cans rolling across the linoleum. The 2 customers near the magazines ducked behind the shelves, and the clerk's hands shot up in surrender. This was definitely a robbery. Without hesitation, Marcus pushed through the door. His voice was calm but commanding as he called out, "Police officer, everyone stay calm." The robber spun around, his eyes wild with panic and something else Marcus couldn't quite identify. The man was young, maybe early 20s, with shaking hands and sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "Get back," the robber screamed, reaching into his jacket. "I said get back." Marcus could see the outline of what might be a weapon, but his training kept him steady. He raised his hands slowly, showing he wasn't armed, and took a small step forward instead of back. 20 years of experience had taught him that sometimes the best way to de-escalate was to show confidence rather than fear. "I'm not here to hurt you," Marcus said softly, "but these people don't deserve to be scared. Whatever's going on, we can work it out." The robber's hand trembled as he pulled what turned out to be a realistic toy gun from his jacket. Even from several feet away, Marcus could tell it was fake, but he knew the responding officers wouldn't have that luxury of time to examine it closely. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer by the second. Marcus realized he had maybe 2 minutes to resolve this situation before patrol units arrived, and potentially turned a scared kid with a toy gun into a tragedy. He had seen too many situations like this go wrong, and he was determined not to let it happen on his watch even though he wasn't officially on duty. "What's your name?" Marcus asked the young man, taking another careful step forward. The robber's eyes darted between Marcus and the approaching sirens, panic growing in his expression. "My name is Marcus. I used to be scared too when I was your age. Made some bad choices that could have ruined everything." The personal touch seemed to reach something in the young man's face, a flicker of recognition that Marcus was trying to help rather than harm. The sirens were getting louder now, and Marcus knew time was running out. The responding officers would come in ready for the worst, and a young black man holding what looked like a gun would be in immediate danger, regardless of the circumstances. Marcus had to act fast to prevent a tragedy that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. The patrol car screeched into the parking lot with lights flashing, followed immediately by 2 more units. Officer Jake Mitchell was the first through the door, his weapon drawn and adrenaline pumping. He had been on the force for 8 years, and robbery calls always put him on high alert. What he saw when he entered the store, however, was not what he expected. 2 black men stood in what appeared to be a standoff near the counter. The younger one held what looked like a handgun, while the older man in the expensive suit seemed to be trying to negotiate. Officer Mitchell's training kicked in automatically. He couldn't see the toy gun clearly from his angle, and the dim lighting made everything look more threatening than it actually was. "Drop the weapon. Both of you, get on the ground now," Mitchell shouted, his voice echoing through the small store. Behind him, Officers Rodriguez and Chen spread out to cover different angles, their weapons also drawn. The situation had just become infinitely more dangerous with 3 armed officers and what they perceived as an armed suspect. Marcus felt his heart sink as he heard the commands. He knew exactly what this looked like to the responding officers. 2 black men, one apparently armed, in the middle of what appeared to be a crime scene. He had been in their position countless times during his career, and he understood their perspective. But he also knew that one wrong move could result in tragedy. "Officers, I'm a police officer," Marcus called out clearly, keeping his hands visible. "The weapon is fake. This young man needs help, not bullets." But Officer Mitchell wasn't taking any chances. From his position near the door, he couldn't see the toy gun clearly enough to confirm Marcus's assessment, and he had no way of verifying Marcus's claim about being a police officer. "I said, get on the ground." "Both of you!" Mitchell repeated, his voice more aggressive this time. The young robber, whose name Marcus had learned was Devin, began to panic as he realized he was surrounded. The toy gun shook in his hands as he looked frantically between Marcus and the officers, unsure of what to do next. Marcus knew he had to make a choice that could save Devin's life. Slowly, he began to lower himself toward the ground, his hands still raised. "Devin, listen to me," he said in a calm voice that somehow carried over the shouting officers. "Put the toy gun down gently and get on the floor. Do exactly what they say and everything will be okay." But Officer Mitchell interpreted Marcus's movement differently. To him, it looked like the older suspect was preparing to take cover or retrieve a weapon. The stress of the situation, combined with the poor lighting and the apparent weapon in Devin's hands, clouded his judgment. He made a split-second decision that would change everything. "He's reaching," Mitchell shouted to his partners, and before Marcus could finish his descent to the ground, the officer lunged forward with his nightstick raised. The impact caught Marcus across the shoulder and neck, sending him sprawling across the convenience store floor. The sound of the blow echoed through the store like a gunshot. Devin immediately dropped the toy gun and fell to his knees, his hands behind his head. "Don't shoot. Please don't shoot. It's fake. It's just a toy," he screamed, tears streaming down his face. The clerk behind the counter began yelling in Spanish, trying to tell the officers that Marcus had been trying to help, but the chaos made communication nearly impossible. Officer Mitchell, his adrenaline still surging, grabbed Marcus by the arm and forced him face down on the cold linoleum floor. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, pressing his knee into Marcus's back as he reached for his handcuffs. Marcus felt the metal cuffs click around his wrists as Mitchell continued the Miranda warning. The pain in Marcus's shoulder was intense, but the humiliation was worse. Here he was 3 days before becoming the chief of police for this very department, being arrested by one of the officers who would soon be under his command. The irony was not lost on him, but more than that, he was deeply concerned about what this incident revealed about the department he was about to lead. As Officer Rodriguez helped Devin to his feet and led him toward a different patrol car, Marcus caught the young man's eye. Despite his own situation, Marcus nodded reassuringly, trying to communicate that everything would be okay. Devin had made a mistake, but he didn't deserve to be traumatized or worse because of it. The store clerk, whose name tag read Carlos, approached Officer Chen with obvious agitation. "The man in the suit, he was helping," Carlos insisted in heavily accented English. "He saved us. He was trying to help that boy." But Officer Chen was busy securing the scene and taking statements, and Carlos's broken English made it difficult for him to convey the full story. As Marcus was lifted to his feet and guided toward the patrol car, he looked back at the convenience store one last time. The fluorescent light still flickered overhead, casting strange shadows across the scene. In just a few minutes, what should have been a simple stop for coffee had turned into a career-defining moment that would test everything he believed about justice, leadership, and the possibility of real change in law enforcement. The fluorescent lights in the police station booking area buzzed incessantly overhead as Marcus sat on the hard metal bench, his hands still cuffed behind his back. The shoulder where Officer Mitchell's nightstick had connected throbbed with each heartbeat, and he could feel swelling beginning to form. Around him, the familiar sounds of a busy police station filled the air. Ringing phones, radio chatter, and the constant shuffle of officers processing arrests from the night shift. Sergeant Lisa Thompson approached the booking desk where Officer Mitchell was completing his paperwork. She had been with the department for 15 years and had seen her share of unusual arrests. But something about this case was bothering her. The well-dressed suspect didn't fit the typical profile of someone who would be involved in an armed robbery, and the store clerk's insistence that the man had been trying to help was hard to ignore. "Mitchell, tell me again what happened at the scene," Sergeant Thompson said, reviewing the incident report. She prided herself on attention to detail, and the inconsistencies in the witness statements were raising red flags. The two customers who had been in the store both claimed that the older suspect had entered after the robbery was already in progress and had been trying to de-escalate the situation. Officer Mitchell, still running on adrenaline from the arrest, recounted his version of events. Two suspects, apparent armed robbery in progress. The older subject was non-compliant and appeared to be reaching for a weapon when I subdued him. The younger suspect surrendered immediately after that. He was confident in his actions, believing he had prevented the situation from escalating further. Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Marcus sat quietly contemplating the bizarre turn his life had taken. In less than 72 hours, he was supposed to walk into this very building as the new chief of police. Instead, he was experiencing firsthand what it felt like to be processed through the system as a suspect. The experience was eye-opening in ways he hadn't anticipated. Devon, the young man with the toy gun, had been placed in a separate holding area. Through the bars, Marcus could see him crying softly, his head in his hands. The kid couldn't be more than 22, and Marcus wondered what desperation had driven him to attempt such a foolish crime. More importantly, he was relieved that the situation hadn't ended tragically for the young man. Detective Ray Barnes entered the booking area carrying a folder thick with paperwork. He had been called in specifically to handle this case because of the unusual circumstances and the conflicting witness statements. Barnes was known throughout the department as a thorough investigator who didn't rush to conclusions, and his reputation for fairness had earned him respect from both colleagues and the community. "Sergeant Thompson, I need to speak with the suspects individually," Detective Barnes announced. "The witness statements aren't adding up, and I want to get a clear picture of what actually happened before we proceed with charges." He had already spoken with Carlos, the store clerk, whose account of events painted a very different picture than what was in Officer Mitchell's initial report. As Detective Barnes approached Marcus's holding cell, he was struck by the man's calm demeanor. Most people who found themselves arrested and facing serious charges would be agitated, demanding lawyers, or proclaiming their innocence loudly. This suspect, however, sat quietly with an almost resigned expression, as if he were observing the process rather than experiencing it personally. "I'm Detective Barnes," he said, unlocking the cell door. "I'd like to ask you some questions about tonight's events." Marcus stood slowly, his injured shoulder making the movement awkward. Despite the circumstances, his posture remained dignified, and his voice was steady when he spoke. "Detective, I understand you're doing your job, but I think there's been a significant misunderstanding," Marcus said calmly. "I'm a police officer myself, and I was attempting to prevent that young man from making a terrible mistake when your officers arrived." The claim seemed unlikely to Detective Barnes. Police officers typically identified themselves immediately when arrested, but something in Marcus's tone suggested he was telling the truth. Detective Barnes led Marcus to an interview room, the same sterile space where he had questioned countless suspects over the years. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus as he sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair across from the detective. He had conducted hundreds of similar interviews during his career, but being on the other side of the table provided a completely new perspective on the process. "If you're a police officer, why didn't you identify yourself to the responding officers?" Detective Barnes asked, studying Marcus's face for any signs of deception. It was a reasonable question, and Marcus had been asking himself the same thing. In the heat of the moment, his focus had been entirely on preventing Devon from getting hurt. "I tried to," Marcus replied honestly. "But the situation was moving too fast, and I was more concerned about preventing a tragedy than protecting myself. That young man had a toy gun, Detective. If I hadn't intervened, he might have been shot by your officers when they arrived." The explanation made sense to Barnes, who had seen similar situations escalate quickly in the past. The detective leaned back in his chair, processing what he had heard. The witness statements all corroborated Marcus's version of events, that he had entered the store after the robbery was in progress and had been trying to calm the situation when police arrived. But the most puzzling aspect was Marcus's claim to be a police officer himself. "What department do you work for?" Detective Barnes asked, pulling out his notepad. The question Marcus had been dreading had finally arrived. In a few hours the news would be public anyway, but he had hoped to avoid this particular revelation under these circumstances. Marcus took a deep breath before answering. "Actually, Detective, as of Monday morning I work for this department. I'm the new chief of police." The words hung in the air between them like a bomb waiting to explode. Detective Barnes's pen froze, mid-sentence as he processed what he had just heard, and the implications began to dawn on him. Detective Barnes stared at Marcus for a full 10 seconds, his pen still frozen above the notepad. The interview room suddenly felt smaller, and the implications of what he had just heard began cascading through his mind like dominoes falling. The new police chief, brutalized and arrested by his own future officers on the eve of taking command. It was the kind of story that could destroy careers and spark citywide protests. "I need to verify this immediately," Detective Barnes said, standing abruptly and heading for the door. His mind was racing through the potential consequences. If Marcus was telling the truth, this incident would become front-page news within hours, and the department's already strained relationship with the community would suffer another devastating blow. Outside the interview room, Detective Barnes pulled out his phone and dialed Captain Rodriguez, the night watch commander. "Captain, I need you to confirm something for me urgently. Do we have a new chief starting Monday?" His voice was tight with tension as he waited for the answer that would either confirm his worst fears or reveal an elaborate lie. Captain Rodriguez, who had been reviewing duty rosters in his office, was puzzled by the question. "Yes, Marcus Williams. Why are you asking, Barnes?" The confirmation hit the detective like a physical blow. The man sitting in handcuffs in his interview room wasn't just any suspect. He was about to become the highest-ranking officer in the department. Back in the interview room, Marcus sat quietly contemplating the chaos that was about to unfold. He had spent months planning his first week as chief, meeting with community leaders, reviewing department policies, and preparing initiatives to rebuild trust with residents. Now his first interaction with his own officers had resulted in his arrest and assault. The symbolism was painfully clear. Detective Barnes returned to the room with Captain Rodriguez, who stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Marcus. The captain had attended several meetings with the incoming chief during the transition process, and there was no mistaking his identity. The color drained from Rodriguez's face as he realized the magnitude of the situation facing the department. "Chief Williams," Captain Rodriguez said formally, though the title sounded strange given the circumstances. We need to get those handcuffs off you immediately." But Marcus held up his hand to stop him. Despite the pain in his shoulder and the humiliation of the arrest, he had been thinking about how to handle this moment. "Captain, I appreciate your concern, but I don't want any special treatment," Marcus said firmly. "What happened tonight happened to a black man who tried to help someone in crisis, not to your incoming chief. If we handle this any differently because of my position, we're proving that there are two different justice systems, one for people like me when you know who I am, and another for everyone else." The wisdom in Marcus's words struck both officers immediately. They had seen countless cases where suspects claimed police brutality, excessive force, or discrimination. Here was their incoming chief, experiencing exactly what community members had been complaining about for years, and he was insisting on being treated like any other citizen. Detective Barnes resumed his questioning, but the dynamic had completely changed. "Chief, can you walk me through exactly what happened from your perspective?" As Marcus recounted the events, both officers realized that the witness statements now made perfect sense. Carlos the clerk, the two customers, and even young Devon had all been trying to tell them the same story. That Marcus had been the hero, not the villain. Meanwhile, word was spreading through the station like wildfire. Officer Mitchell, still completing his paperwork, was approached by Sergeant Thompson with a grim expression. "Jake, we need to talk. The man you arrested tonight, do you know who he is?" The question sent a chill down Mitchell's spine. Something in the sergeant's tone told him his career was about to take a very different turn. When Mitchell learned the identity of the man he had struck with his nightstick and arrested, he felt physically sick. All his training about de-escalation and community policing suddenly took on new meaning. He had just brutalized the very person who had been hired to reform the department and improve community relations. The irony was almost too painful to comprehend. In the holding area, Devon was finally informed that he would be charged with attempted robbery, but that the toy gun and his cooperation would likely result in reduced charges. More importantly, he learned about the man who had tried to help him. "That man saved my life," Devon told Officer Rodriguez. "If he hadn't been there, I probably would have done something stupid when you guys showed up with guns drawn." As the night wore on, the full story began to emerge. Security camera footage from the store confirmed every detail of Marcus's account. The timestamp showed clearly that he had entered after the robbery was already in progress. Audio captured his attempts to de-escalate the situation and his efforts to communicate with the responding officers. Captain Rodriguez faced an impossible decision. Protocol demanded that he notify the mayor and city council immediately about the arrest of the incoming police chief. But he also knew that how he handled the next few hours would determine whether this incident became a catalyst for positive change or a public relations disaster that destroyed the department's credibility forever. The media would inevitably learn about the story. Police scanner apps and social media made it impossible to keep arrests quiet for long. The question wasn't whether the story would break, but how the department would frame it when it did. Would they admit their mistakes and use this as an opportunity for growth, or would they try to cover it up and face even worse consequences later? As dawn approached, Detective Barnes finished documenting every detail of the incident. The evidence was overwhelming. Marcus Williams had been the victim of exactly the kind of police misconduct that had prompted the city to hire him as chief in the first place. The challenge now was figuring out how to turn this disaster into an opportunity for the meaningful reform everyone claimed to want. Mayor Patricia Henderson's phone rang at 5:47 a.m., jolting her awake from the first decent sleep she'd had in weeks. As the city's first black female mayor, she had made police reform the cornerstone of her administration, and hiring Marcus Williams as chief had been the most important decision of her tenure. The voice on the other end of the line was Captain Rodriguez, and his news made her stomach drop. "Madam Mayor, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention," Rodriguez said carefully. "Chief Williams was involved in an incident last night." The captain's deliberate choice of words didn't hide the gravity of the situation, and Mayor Henderson knew from his tone that her carefully planned reform agenda was about to face its biggest test. Within an hour, an emergency meeting was convened in the mayor's office. Present were Mayor Henderson, City Attorney David Park, Police Captain Rodriguez, Detective Barnes, and Deputy Chief Maria Santos, who had been serving as interim chief until Marcus's arrival. The room was tense as Detective Barnes presented his findings from the night's investigation. "The evidence is clear," Detective Barnes reported. "Chief Williams entered the store after the robbery was in progress and attempted to de-escalate the situation. Officer Mitchell used excessive force in subduing him, apparently due to a misunderstanding about the circumstances." The security footage played on the mayor's laptop screen, showing the events exactly as Marcus had described them. City Attorney Park was already thinking about liability and lawsuits. "This is a nightmare scenario from a legal perspective," he said bluntly. "The incoming police chief, brutalized by his own officers, while trying to help citizens. Every civil rights organization in the country will be calling for investigations." But Mayor Henderson was thinking beyond legal implications. To the broader message this incident sent about the possibility of real change. Deputy Chief Santos, a 30-year veteran of the force, provided crucial context. "Officer Mitchell is a good officer who made a mistake under pressure," she said. "But this incident highlights exactly why we need the kind of leadership Chief Williams represents. The question is whether we can use this tragedy as a catalyst for the changes we've all been talking about." Meanwhile, at the police station, Officer Mitchell sat in Captain Rodriguez's office facing the worst moment of his career. The video footage left no room for interpretation. He had assaulted an innocent man who was trying to help. Worse, that man was about to become his commanding officer. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a physical force. "Jake, I've known you for 8 years," Captain Rodriguez said quietly. You're a good cop who made a terrible mistake. The question now is what you're going to do about it. Mitchell knew his career hung in the balance, but more importantly, he was beginning to understand the impact his actions had on the community's trust in police. Back at the mayor's office, the discussion turned to how to handle the media storm that was inevitably coming. Word was already spreading through social media, and local news outlets were beginning to pick up the story. The city faced a choice. They could try to minimize the incident and protect their image, or they could confront it head-on and use it as an opportunity for honest discussion about police reform. We need to hear from Chief Williams himself, Mayor Henderson decided. This is his decision to make as much as anyone's. A call was placed to Marcus, who had finally been released and was at home with his wife and children, explaining why he looked like he'd been in a fight. His family was shaken by the incident, but they understood its significance. When Marcus arrived at City Hall, his presence immediately changed the energy in the room. Despite the bruising on his neck and the obvious stiffness in his shoulder, he carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had impressed the search committee during his interviews. More importantly, he had spent the early morning hours thinking deeply about what this incident meant for his mission. "I won't lie to you," Marcus began, addressing the group assembled in the mayor's office. "Last night was traumatic and humiliating, but it was also educational in ways I hadn't expected." He paused, looking around the room at faces filled with concern and uncertainty. "I experienced exactly what community members have been trying to tell us for years, what it feels like to be judged by your appearance rather than your character." The mayor leaned forward in her chair. "Marcus, no one would blame you if you decided this isn't the right time or place for you to serve as chief. This incident has created complications none of us anticipated." But Marcus had already made his decision, and it wasn't what anyone expected to hear. "Actually, Mayor Henderson, I think this incident makes it more important than ever that I take this job," Marcus said firmly. "Officer Mitchell made a mistake, but it's the kind of mistake that happens when officers are trained to see threats instead of human beings. Last night I wasn't a police officer or a chief. I was just another black man who looked suspicious to someone with a badge and a weapon." City Attorney Park shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Chief, if you're suggesting the department engaged in racial profiling or excessive force, that creates significant legal exposure for the city." But Marcus wasn't interested in lawsuits or settlements. He was thinking about something much more valuable. "I'm not interested in legal action," Marcus said, surprising everyone in the room. "But I am interested in using this experience to build the kind of department our community deserves. Officer Mitchell needs training, not termination. And this incident needs to be a wake-up call for every officer in the department about the impact of their actions on the people they serve." Detective Barnes, who had remained quiet through most of the meeting, finally spoke up. "Chief, if you don't mind me asking, how do you plan to lead officers who arrested and assaulted you? Some of them might not be ready to accept your authority after what happened." It was a fair question that went to the heart of the leadership challenge Marcus now faced. Marcus smiled for the first time since entering the room. "Detective, I plan to lead them the same way I would want to be led, with honesty, accountability, and a commitment to doing better. Last night showed me exactly what we're up against, and it also showed me that change is possible if we're willing to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves." The decision was made. Marcus would take the oath of office as scheduled on Monday morning, and the incident would be addressed publicly and transparently. It wasn't the smooth transition anyone had planned, but it might turn out to be exactly the kind of catalyst the department needed to begin the difficult work of real reform. Monday morning arrived with unprecedented media attention, focused on the police headquarters. News vans lined the street, and reporters from local and national outlets waited for the swearing-in ceremony of the police chief, who had been brutalized by his own officers just days earlier. Inside the building, officers gathered in the main briefing room, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, embarrassment, and uncertainty about what their new leader would say. Officer Jake Mitchell stood in the back of the room, his uniform pressed and his badge polished, but his confidence shattered. He had spent the weekend writing and rewriting a letter of resignation, unable to imagine how he could continue working for the man he had assaulted. His wife had convinced him to attend the ceremony before making any final decisions, but he remained convinced his career was over. Marcus Williams entered the briefing room at exactly 9 a.m., wearing a crisp uniform with the chief's insignia he had earned through 2 decades of service. The bruising on his neck was still visible, a stark reminder of Friday night's events, but his posture was straight and his expression was calm. The room fell silent as he approached the podium. "Good morning," Marcus began, his voice carrying easily through the packed room. "I know this isn't how any of us expected to begin this relationship, and I want to address Friday night's incident directly before we talk about anything else." He paused, making eye contact with officers throughout the room, including Mitchell in the back. 3 nights ago, I was arrested and assaulted by members of this department while trying to prevent a young man from making a mistake that could have cost him his life, Marcus continued. Officer Mitchell struck me with his nightstick because, in a tense situation with poor lighting, I looked like a threat to him rather than a fellow law enforcement officer trying to help. The silence in the room was complete. Many officers had heard rumors about the incident, but this was the first official acknowledgement of what had happened. Marcus's decision to address it publicly, rather than handle it quietly behind closed doors, surprised everyone present. "I could be angry about what happened," Marcus said, his voice remaining steady. "I could file complaints, demand suspensions, or make this incident about my personal experience, but that would miss the point entirely." He gestured toward the officers assembled before him. "What happened to me happens to citizens in our community far too often, and usually without the benefit of security cameras or witnesses willing to speak up." Detective Barnes, who had been promoted to shift supervisor that morning as part of Marcus's new command structure, watched the reactions of his colleagues carefully. Some officers seemed genuinely moved by their new chief's words, while others appeared skeptical of his approach. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, when policies and procedures were implemented. "Officer Mitchell," Marcus called out, and every head in the room turned toward the back where Jake stood frozen. "Would you please join me up here?" The request sent a shock through the room. Mitchell's face went pale as he made his way forward, certain he was about to be publicly disciplined or fired in front of his colleagues. When Mitchell reached the front of the room, Marcus extended his hand. "Officer Mitchell made a mistake that could have had tragic consequences," Marcus said as they shook hands. "But he's also agreed to help me develop new training protocols for de-escalation and implicit bias recognition. His experience, combined with mine, is going to make this department better at serving all of our citizens." The gesture was unprecedented. Instead of punishing the officer who had assaulted him, the new chief was making him a partner in reform efforts. Mitchell felt tears welling up in his eyes as he realized he was being offered redemption rather than retribution. It was a leadership approach unlike anything he had experienced in his 8 years on the force. "This department is going to change," Marcus announced to the room, "not because change is popular or because politicians demand it, but because the community we serve deserves better than what we've been giving them. Every officer in this room will receive additional training in de-escalation, cultural competency, and community engagement. We're going to learn to see citizens as partners rather than potential threats." Sergeant Lisa Thompson, who had been promoted to lieutenant as part of the restructuring, stepped forward to begin the formal swearing-in ceremony. As Marcus raised his right hand and repeated the oath of office, the symbolism was powerful. A man who had been victimized by police misconduct was now taking command of the department that had failed him, with the commitment to ensure it never failed anyone else the same way. After the ceremony, Marcus held his first press conference as chief. The questions from reporters were pointed and challenging, focusing on his plans for Officer Mitchell, his response to the assault, and his vision for departmental reform. His answers were direct and honest, acknowledging the problems while outlining concrete steps for improvement. "Chief Williams, how can you trust officers who were willing to assault you?" asked Sarah Chen from the local newspaper. It was the question everyone wanted answered, and Marcus had given it considerable thought over the weekend. "Trust isn't given, it's earned," Marcus replied. "Officer Mitchell and I will earn each other's trust by working together to make sure no one else experiences what I experienced on Friday night. Real change doesn't happen through punishment and blame. It happens through acknowledgement, accountability, and the hard work of doing better." In the weeks that followed, the Marcus Williams incident, as it came to be known, became a national case study in police reform and leadership. The chief who had been brutalized by his own officers and then chose reconciliation over retaliation became a symbol of the possibility for positive change in law enforcement. Officer Mitchell became one of the department's most effective advocates for reform, sharing his story with other officers and helping to develop training programs that addressed the unconscious biases that had led to his mistake. His partnership with Chief Williams proved that even the most difficult situations could become opportunities for growth and healing. Devon, the young man whose attempted robbery had started the entire chain of events, completed community service and entered a job training program supported by the police department. His case became an example of how the justice system could focus on rehabilitation rather than simply punishment, and he eventually became a youth counselor working with at-risk teenagers in the community. 6 months after the incident, the department's community approval ratings had improved dramatically. Complaints of excessive force had dropped by 60%, and community participation in police programs had tripled. The changes weren't just statistical, they were visible in the daily interactions between officers and residents. Throughout the city, Marcus Williams had transformed a moment of personal trauma into a catalyst for systemic change. His leadership style, forged in the crucible of being victimized by the very system he now led, created a new model for police reform that other cities began studying and implementing. The chief who had been brutalized by his own officers had proven that even the most broken relationships could be healed through courage, honesty, and the unwavering commitment to justice for all. The convenience store where it all began became an unlikely symbol of transformation. Carlos, the clerk who had witnessed everything, often told customers about the night when a police chief proved that real change was possible. The store's security camera footage, once evidence of a tragic misunderstanding, became a training tool used in police academies across the country to teach officers about the importance of seeing the humanity in every person they encounter. As Chief Williams walked through the neighborhoods he served, residents who had once viewed police with suspicion now approached him with respect and trust. Children who had been taught to fear officers now waved and asked questions about police work. The transformation wasn't complete. Real change takes time. But the foundation had been laid for a different kind of relationship between law enforcement and the community. Officer Mitchell, now a sergeant and head of the department's new Community Relations Division, often reflected on how a single moment of poor judgment had led to the most important learning experience of his career. His partnership with Chief Williams had shown him that mistakes didn't have to define a person. What mattered was how they responded to those mistakes and what they did to ensure they never happened again. The story of the officer who brutalized his future chief became more than just a news story. It became a testament to the power of forgiveness, the possibility of redemption, and the truth that even in our darkest moments, we have the opportunity to choose a better path forward. In a time when trust between police and communities seemed impossible to rebuild, Marcus Williams and Jake Mitchell proved that with courage, honesty, and commitment to justice, even the most damaged relationships could be healed and transformed into something stronger than before.